that the Constitution protects a woman's right to abortion. And she explained it like this, and I quote, "The decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a woman's life, to her well-being and dignity. It's a decision she must make for herself. When government controls that decision for her, she is being treated as less than a fully adult human, responsible for her own choice," end quote. At one point, our former colleague, Orrin Hatch, then the ranking member of this committee, commended her for her being, quote, "very forthright in talking about that," end quote. So I hope, and you have been thus far, be equally forthright with your answers. In Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey, Justice Scalia, as was said earlier, joined the dissent, which took the position, and I quote, "We believe that Roe was wrongly decided and that it can and should be overruled, consistent with our traditional approach to stare decisis in constitutional cases." Do you agree with Justice Scalia's view that Roe was wrongly decided?
So, Senator, I do want to be forthright and answer every question so far as I can. I think on that question, I'm going to invoke Justice Kagan's description, which I think is perfectly put. When she was in her confirmation hearing, she said that she was not going to grade precedent or give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And I think in an area where precedent continues to be pressed and litigated, as is true of Casey, it would be particularly, it would actually be wrong and a violation of the canons for me to do that as a sitting judge. So if I express a view on a precedent one way or another, whether I say I love it or I hate it, it signals to litigants that I might tilt one way or another in a pending case.
So on something that is really a major cause with major effect on over half of the population of this country, who are women, after all, it's distressing not to get a straight answer. So let me try again. Do you agree with Justice Scalia's view that Roe was wrongly decided?
Senator, I completely understand why you are asking the question, but again, I can't pre-commit or say, yes, I'm going in with some agenda, because I'm not. I don't have any agenda. I have no agenda to try to overrule Casey. I have an agenda to stick to the rule of law and decide cases as they come.
Well, as a person, I don't know if you'll answer this one either. Do you agree with Justice Scalia's view that Roe can and should be overturned by the Supreme Court?
Well, I think my answer is the same, because, that's a case that's litigated. It could, its contours could come up again. In fact, do come up. They came up last term before the court. So I think, what the Casey standard is, and it's a contentious issue, which is, I know, one reason why it would be comforting to you to have an answer. But I can't express views on cases or pre-commit to approaching a case any particular way.
Well, that makes it difficult for me, and I think for other women also on this committee, because this is a very important case, and it affects a lot of people, millions and millions of women, and you could be a very important vote. And I had hoped you would say, as a person, you've got a lovely family, you understand all the implications of family life. You should be very proud of that. I'm proud of you for that. But my position is a little different. You're going on the biggest court of this land with a problem out there that all women see one way or another in their life. And not all, but certainly married women do, and others too. And so the question comes, what happens? And will this justice support a law that has substantial precedent now? Would you commit yourself on whether you would or would not?
Senator, what I will commit is that I will obey all the rules of stare decisis, that if a question comes up before me about whether Casey or any other case should be overruled, that I will follow the law of stare decisis, applying it as the court has articulated it, applying all the factors, reliance, workability, being undermined by later facts and law, just all the standard factors. And I promise to do that for any issue that comes up, abortion or anything else. I'll follow the law.
Well, I think that's expected, and I can. Let me go to another issue. This country is facing great gun violence. There's been a surge in gun sales during the COVID-19 crisis, which has led to more lives being needlessly lost. According to the Gun Violence Archive, an independent research organization, there were 60 mass shootings in May alone. These shootings killed 40 people. They hurt 250 more. Also, there's been a troubling spike in gun sales. Americans bought approximately 2 million guns this past March. It's the second highest month ever for gun sales. That figure does not take into account all the gun sales that could not be completed because the purchaser failed a background check, a number that has also skyrocketed. For example, this past March, the FBI's background check system blocked 23,692 sales, more than double the 9,500 sales blocked in March of 2019. Do you agree that federal, state, and local governments have a compelling interest in preventing a rise in gun violence, particularly during a pandemic?
Well, Senator, of course, the constitutionality of any particular measure that was passed by state or local governments or by this body would be subject to the same judicial process that I described with Senator Graham. What I will say, because this is just descriptive of Heller leaves room for gun regulations. And that's why there has been a lot of litigation in the lower courts, which makes me constrained not to comment on the limits of it. But Heller does not make a right absolute, says so in the opinion.
Well, let me ask one more question. In a recent dissenting opinion that you wrote, you said there was, quote, no question, end quote, that, quote, keeping guns out of the hands of those who are likely to misuse them, quote, is, quote, a very strong governmental interest. Do you stand by that statement?
So let's see. I can't remember precisely the words of Cantor, which is the case in which I dissented.
That's correct, Cantor v. Barr.
Cantor v. Barr. What I said in that opinion, I stand by, which is that the original meaning of the Second Amendment, and I went through a lot of detailed history in that case, does support the idea that governments are free to keep guns out of the hands of the dangerous.
For a moment, from a different issue perspective, bear with me for a couple questions. Have you seen the George Floyd video?
I have.
What impact did it have on you?
Senator, as you might imagine, given that I have 2 Black children, that was very, very personal for my family. Jesse was with the boys on a camping trip out in South Dakota, so I was there, and my 17-year-old daughter, Vivian, who's adopted from Haiti, all of this was erupting. It was very difficult for her. We wept together in my room, and then it was also difficult for my daughter, Juliet, who's 10. I had to try to explain some of this to them. I mean, my children, to this point in their lives, have had the benefit of growing up in a cocoon where they have not yet experienced hatred or violence. And for Vivian, to understand that there would be a risk to her brother or the son she might have one day of that kind of brutality has been an ongoing conversation. It's a difficult one for us, like it is for Americans all over the country.
And so I'd like to ask you, as an originalist who obviously has a passion for history, I can't imagine that you could separate the two, to reflect on the history of this country. Where are we today when it comes to the issue of race? Some argue it's fine. Everything's fine, and you don't have to even teach children about the history of slavery or discrimination. Others say there's implicit bias in so many aspects of American life that we have to be very candid about and address. Others go further and say, no, it's systemic racism that's built into America, and we have to be much more pointed in our addressing it. How do you feel?
So I think it is an entirely uncontroversial and obvious statement, given, as we just talked about, the George Floyd video, that racism persists in our country. As to putting my finger on the nature of the problem, whether, as you say, it's just outright or systemic racism, or how to tackle the issue of making it better, those things, are policy questions. They're hotly contested policy questions that have been in the news and discussed all summer. So while, as I did share my personal experience, I'm very, happy to discuss the reaction our family had to the George Floyd video, giving broader statements or making, broader diagnoses about the problem of racism is kind of beyond what I'm capable of doing as a judge.
Well, I would doubt that. I just don't believe you can be as passionate about originalism and the history behind language that we've had for decades, if not centuries, without having some thought about where we stand today. But I'm not going to press you on that. I'm going to take you to a case which I have read and reread, Cantor versus Barr. Mm-hmm. And you know the case well because it's already been referred to. Mm-hmm. And it clearly is a case where you had your day in court. You wrote the sole dissent. In a 64-page case, 37 pages were your dissent. So you gave to the court, I assume, a pretty full accounting of your thoughts on the subject. And here's the way I understand the case. A fellow named Ricky Cantor from Mequon, Wisconsin, invented some pads to put in a shoe to be sold to particularly older Americans under Medicare to relieve foot pain. And he designed them and submitted them to Medicare and didn't get the approval that he was looking for, but instead sold them and represented to many customers that they had been approved by Medicare. Mm-hmm. And so he was charged with fraud. Now, this wasn't a matter of a casual misapplication of the law. When it was all said and done, Ricky Cantor of Mequon, Wisconsin, ended up spending over a year and a day in federal prison, paying somewhere near $300,000 in penalties and fines and $27 million in a civil settlement on this issue. So this was not a casual wrongdoing. This man was a swindler, and he was taking the federal government for a ride as well as other customers and misleading senior citizens about his product and paid a heavy price for it. Then he decided, having left prison, that it's just fundamentally unfair that the law says that if you've been convicted of a felony, you can't own a firearm. Now, I don't know what his appetite is when it comes to firearms, whether it's a revolver or a AK-47 with a banana clip. I have no idea. But he went to court and said, this is unfair. It was just mail fraud, and you're taking away my Second Amendment rights. So 2 out of 3 of your colleagues then basically said, sorry, Ricky, you have forfeited your right to own a firearm because of your conviction of a felony. You took a different approach, exactly the opposite approach, and went deep into history. I think the earliest citation I see here was 1662 to figure out just what was going on here and whether or not he had to have committed a violent felony to have forfeited this right to own a firearm. Have I stated the facts close to what you remember?
I don't remember the amount of the loss, some of those details, but yes, Ricky Cantor was convicted of selling fraudulent shoe inserts, and it was a felony. Mm-hmm.
$27 million settlement along the way. So I'd like to take you into your thinking on this. When the Heller decision was handed down, Justice Scalia expressly said, I'm not taking away the authority of government to impose limitations based on felonies, not violent felonies, felonies and mental illness. He said as much in the Heller decision. And yet, this man who was your inspiration, as you've told us all, you decided he was wrong and that it had to be a violent felony. Can you explain why?
I can. So we've talked about precedent, and in my court, the Seventh Circuit, there is precedent saying that that phrase doesn't control, as my colleague Judge Frank Easterbrook has said a number of times, that judicial opinions aren't statutes and shouldn't be read as if they were. So Heller obviously wasn't about the scope of the right, its application to felons or those who are mentally ill, et cetera. And so that passage was dicta. It didn't fully dive down into it. But what I did was apply Heller's methodology. Both Justice Scalia's majority opinion and Justice Stevens' dissent used an originalist methodology to answer that question. And I concluded that based on that history, one couldn't take the right away simply because one was a felon, that there had to be a showing of dangerousness. And I didn't rule out the possibility that the government might be able to make that showing about Ricky Cantor. But I think we could all agree that we ought to be careful of saying that because someone's a felon, they lose any of their individual rights.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.